Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce came back to life in the postseason last year. We discussed why we think they can carry over that momentum, plus hit on the rest of the Chiefs' fantasy outlook on today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. I am one of your co-hosts, Michelle Magdziuk, and when I'm not doing this, I'm a researcher and fantasy analyst with NFL Network.
And I'm your other co-host, Vinnie Iyer, and when I'm not doing this, I am writing about NFL fantasy and betting for sportingnews.com. Check it out. I have the 25 under 25 team up there to check out. It's a lot of good young fantasy stars on there as well.
Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. We are going through all 32 teams, giving each team their own episode and discussing all of their offensive players that are fantasy relevant and just giving you our, fantasy takes on them for the 2024 season. We have now gone through every NFC team. So if you missed any team in the NFC, go watch those after this episode, watch or listen. Today, we're starting with the AFC, and we're starting with the Super Bowl champions, the Kansas City Chiefs. We know how great they are, right? But last year for fantasy, they kind of struggled. Patrick Mahomes was down in fantasy points. Travis Kelce was still a top-tier tight end, but not what we're used to. And then all of a sudden, they broke out in the postseason, and we're back to their old selves, right? So we're hoping that kind of comes over to the next season. They did add wide receivers because that's where they're struggling last year. They added Hollywood Brown in free agency. They drafted Xavier Worthy in the first round. So there is hope this year. Let's start with the most expensive fantasy player on this offense, Travis Kelce. Old man Travis Kelce, 35 years old this year. What do you expect out of him? Because last year we kind of saw the drop off a bit. It was great the first half of the season, fell off a little bit in the second half of the season. And then, postseason, he came back to life. Is he still worth that top tier tight end cost this year, Vinny?
Well, right now he's ranked as tight end 2, which is kind of interesting because he finishes a lower type of guy last year that we didn't get used to in terms of the overall scoring. But in average scoring, he actually was still right up there at tight end 4. So when you look at it like tight end 2 ranking, he's finished tight end 1 or tight end 2 in every season from 2019 to 22. The one season he was not, it was Mark Andrews just ahead of him. So he's been as consistent as it gets as a fantasy asset, but he does turn 35 in October. He's still the buzziest guy in the NFL with all his antics, meeting the King of England and all this stuff that's been going on here. So I think it's interesting that he's now known more for off the field, but he's still productive on the field. We know that. It's just not what we're used to in terms of, okay, there are some tight ends that we're more interested in maybe on the board. Right now, he's tight end 2 behind Sam Laporta, 28 overall. 33 is his ADP, so taking him a little bit behind where the industry has ranked him. He's weirdly right behind Sam Laporta overall, who's 27th. And then you have a drop off there. Andrews is 49th and Trey McBride is 53rd here, Michelle. Do you like Travis Kelce as a value? I mean, you have to still spend a pretty high pick on him behind Laporta, but then you can wait. I mean, looking at this, 2+ rounds and get Mark Andrews or Trey McBride. How are you handling Travis Kelce? He's been a can't miss player that you could even take in the first round. I'm not sure that's the case this year.
Yeah, so the thing with Kelce is he still scored almost identical points in points per game to Sam Laporta last year, who was the tight end one. It was like 0.02 points per game difference. So Travis Kelce is still going to be a top 3 tight end this year. The difference, though, between that and what we're used to with Kelce is we were down to pay up for Kelce because he was going to be so much different than those other top tight ends, right? He was going to outscore them by so much that it was just such an advantage to have him in your tight end spot. I don't think we're going to get that again from Kelce, maybe ever, right? He's, like I said, he's 35 years old in October. Kelce last year had the most receiving yards from a tight end in his age 34 season or older ever. And then when looking at just like NFL history here with fantasy points. There has never been a tight end to score more than 11.8 fantasy points per game in half PPR at age 34 or older, which Kelce is going to be 35. Antonio Gates in 2014 had the highest fantasy points per game season by a tight end at that age at 11.8 points per game. And again, if he scores 11.8 points per game, he could still be the tight end one on the year because that's right around what Sam Laporta scored last year. But it's just not that this difference maker that's like driving me to pay up for that cost.
Yeah, he's just not that separator anymore. And keep in mind, I'm going to use an NBA term here, is load management. They're going to be careful with him. They're going to maybe peel back his snaps a little bit in key situations here. They do have a little bit of depth, not a lot at that position, but Noah Gray's been hanging around there on the step chart. And I think they are looking a little bit at the future with their draft. So I think when you look at Kelce, they'll be careful with him. They're not going to just expose him to as many hits. He's getting older. They want to preserve his body because this team is playing a ton of games. They were like the Patriots were at one point where they had to play deep in the postseason, recover, shorter offseason than every other team. They've done this now back-to-back years where this is a long, long time for them to play football in consecutive years. So you probably will start slow. I'll keep that in mind. Keep in mind, he also missed the first game last year, and that kind of was interesting. You didn't get him right away against the Lions. So they were careful with him right from the get-go. So something you want to definitely watch for Travis Kelce is that the Lions are hungry. They want to win. They're going to play Sam Laporta every chance they get. Trey McBride is a key target for the Cardinals. They're going to put him out there with Kyler Murray all the time. And the Ravens need Mark Andrews a lot with their receiving core. So these guys are going to play a ton. I think you might see some management with Andrews as well because they do have Isaiah Likely. So keep that in mind. I would feel most comfortable about Laporta. I think you look at the Lions situation, it is still pretty high up there. You just have to get used to it. It's really hard to say Laporta is the guy that Kelce was, but I think you just have to start embracing that. I'm not sure I want to kind of reach for Kelce that much ahead of Andrews or McBride.
Yeah, I do think Kelce is going to be very consistent from week to week. Like he's going to do, you're not going to feel bad having him. I just don't think he's going to win you as many weeks as we're used to. So I think when you can get a Dalton Kincaid 20 picks later and he could be the folk, like I think he can play that Travis Kelce role because right now the Bills are really struggling at wide receiver while the Chiefs have tried to change their wide receiver room, add more pieces. So I think we can see Kincaid here maybe finish with more targets, maybe finish with more touchdowns than Kelce, get him 20 picks later. So when you're comparing those ADPs, like I'm going to wait for Kincaid and let someone else take Kelce, but I don't think it's a bad pick. Like I don't think taking Travis Kelce in the top of the third round is necessarily a bad pick. I just don't think it's that advantage that like, that just like that secret little guy that you can have in your lineup every week. That's just, he's just a cheat code. I don't think that's going to happen for Kelce anymore moving forward.
Yeah, you just have to be calculated on where you take him. It'll just feel right when you're not feeling it at quarterback and running back and wide receiver. You're just going to go to that pivot. It's very interesting. He's kind of ranked near Patrick Mahomes on the board, and so you might have to make a decision. You used to be able to get Mahomes and Kelce. Now you might have to say, I can only get one of these guys. So it'll be a lot of fun. And speaking of Mahomes, we'll break down where his value is in our next segment, as well as that of Isiah Pacheco, getting a lot of buzz as an RB1. And then we'll get into those Chiefs wide receivers in our final segment on today's show. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performances: superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether into speed, power, style, eBay Motors has got you covered with more than 122 million parts. For your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because at eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the price you want for your car, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home those huge wins, much like the Chiefs. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, Michelle, it is time to look at Patrick Mahomes, and he actually was not an elite fantasy option last year. QB 12 in points per game. That was a drop off. He was number 2 to Jalen Hurts in 2022. Now he's ranked at QB3. I mentioned right near Travis Kelce, 33rd overall on the board. 40 is his ADP, so everyone's taking him a little bit later. Now, just to set the table up for you, Michelle, Josh Allen is going at 20. Jalen Hurts is going at 25. Lamar Jackson is going at 37, right behind him. And you have CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson, 46 and 50. And then Joe Burrow bringing up that group at 58 in the top 5 rounds. Now, where do you think Mahomes should be ranked? And is this fair to think he'll have that big bounce back?
I know. I wish his price was a little bit lower after his down year, because it really was a very brutal year for Patrick Mahomes. I mean, the second half of the year, he didn't have a finish higher than quarterback 9 in any given week. And there was finishes of 29 and 15 and 16, 19, 17, 17, 21, like a long stretch of time where he was really killing you. Now, I know the rest of his career, like quarterback 3 in points per game in 2022, quarterback 5 in 2021, quarterback 2 in 2020. Like, they were all good, right? And he's definitely probably should bounce back to be a top 5 quarterback. But when you draft a guy that early in a draft, because he's still going extremely early, quarterback 3, 38th overall, like, he needs to be better than everyone else. He needs to be at like, you're shooting for the quarterback 1 in that situation. It's not like taking the quarterback 9 later in the draft and he finishes quarterback 9. Cool. That's cool. Like, you're just not going to feel good about it if you take Mahomes at quarterback 3 and he finishes at 3, 4, 5. It's not going to be that difference maker quarterback that's worth that high of a pick. So I'm personally out on taking Mahomes that early, although I do think he is going to have a bounce back year.
Yeah, he should have a bounce back year. I think maybe it's more QB 5, 6 in that range, and I think that's fair. I think Joe Burrow has the opportunity to put up the same type of numbers if he's fully healthy with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. I mean, he's got weapons that offense is going to put up a lot of numbers in Cincinnati. I think where I would avoid it, maybe this, I don't want to call it a quarterback dead zone, but I don't think it's a good value zone between Mahomes there, Lamar Jackson at 37, and I mentioned Stroud and Richardson, 46 and 50. I think those are way too high of costs for a jump on those two guys when there's some really good values later, such as Jordan Love. Even if he struggles, I think he's going to be a good value based on where he's taken. Now, Mahomes also, if you look at this, Michelle, taking a deeper dive, look at some of the players you could get around Mahomes if you're going to draft him instead. Wide receiver Nico Collins, Michael Pittman Jr., Jalen Waddle, DK Metcalf. At running back, you can get Devin Chan. And I mentioned Kelce. How about this? Isiah Pacheco is also going around where Mahomes is going. So do you feel, I think maybe I would think about him over those running backs, but those wide receivers seem a lot more appealing here than jumping on Mahomes.
Yeah, I think you're going to feel it. If you take Mahomes, I think you're going to feel it with depth, either at running back or wide receiver. It's just not going to feel as strong as a team. Then, especially like you mentioned, you can get a Jordan Love or a Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, Brock Purdy later in the draft, where you're not, giving up one of these prime wide receivers you can grab here. And I think you're going to look at your team if you take Mahomes, and it's not going to feel great. You're going to need Mahomes to have just a killer season. And I don't, as much as I think he's going to bounce back, I still don't think he has the weapons necessary to throw 50 touchdowns again, like he did when he had Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce, a younger Travis Kelce. I don't see that happening again just yet in his career. So yeah, I'm taking those wide receivers, and even I'm still taking Josh Jacobs over Patrick Mahomes, like a guy like that, or even James Cook. I'd rather take a value on a running back than reach on Mahomes.
Well, one of those running backs that you might have to decide with Mahomes is Pacheco. I mentioned he was RB 15 and half point PPR points per game last season. 12.1 was the average. Pretty solid. That's what you're looking for in your second running back in fantasy. He's going, however, is the RB 11. So that's pushing him 4 spots above. He's right around 35, 38 is his ADP here in the rankings and draft position. He was pretty big after week 10, but he did have to miss some time down the stretch. He had a lot of double-digit performances there. And I think this was the part of the reason Mahomes kind of faded a little bit. They were very good at running the ball. They have a very good run blocking line with Creed Humphrey, Trey Smith, some of the guys that they have, Joe Thuney up front. So this is kind of their strength. We're very weak, we know, at the tackles because Juwan Taylor was just very bad. So they're a better run blocking team overall. I think Mahomes masks a lot of their pass protection issues. So when you look at that, it's potential for Pacheco. They brought back Clyde Edwards-Helaire, but he's ranked at RB66. So I think there's a lot of potential here with Pacheco, but maybe his value's capped, right? I think to really live up to that expectation, he's got to be an integral part of the passing game. I'm not sure that's going to happen consistently enough to get him up there.
Yeah, with Pacheco, I just think he doesn't really have a ceiling. Could he end as RB12? Absolutely. And it'll be fine. Like, this is another pick where if you pick him, it's going to be a fine pick. I don't think it's going to kill you. It's just not a guy that has very high upside. I like guys that have higher upside than these players, especially because you can find Pacheco's later in the draft. You really can. That will just give you that kind of consistent 10 to 13 points. That's really what Pacheco does. The targets last year, like, you would have thought they're going to, if they're going to come at any point in his career, they were going to come last year when they were desperate for receivers. Like, now they have added Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy. Rashee Rice is going into his second season. Maybe he misses a few games, but he still should be there most of the time. Kelce hopefully is healthier this year. Like, they have all the receivers they need now. And also last year, he was horribly efficient on his receptions, 5.5 yards per reception. That's just disgusting, right? So it didn't work out for him last year when they did have to give him 49 targets. And also in the playoffs when they gave him 12, like, he had 12 receptions, again, only averaged 5 yards per reception. So it wasn't positive when he did catch a ball. It wasn't like, oh, we need to get this ball in the hands of Pacheco more in the receiving game because he's so good once he does that. Like, that's not really his game. So, like, what's the difference between Pacheco and James Conner? I don't really think all that different, besides the fact you can get Conner way, way later in drafts.
Yeah, I think those are some of the guys that you look at. To James Conner a little bit later. I'm not totally sold on him holding up. I like Pacheco being a little bit younger, but then you threw out Josh Jacobs earlier, an alternative Mahomes. I mean, he's a guy that is going to see high volume and has done it before. And then you have guys such as Rachaad White and James Cook who are going to be more efficient and more involved in the pass game. Then when you look at ceiling versus floor, you look at Devin Achane. He's right there with Pacheco. I mean, who has a higher ceiling than Devin Achane this year? I mean, we saw what he did with limited touches. So, yeah, it's not the most exciting pick. Is it a solid pick? Yes, but I'd rather do it a little bit later, just a few picks later. I mean, when we look at that wide receiver value, we talk about the same guys, Collins, Pittman, Waddle, Metcalf. These guys are special. They can stand out. They're all either one or two on their team as receivers. So I think where Pacheco falls right now, a little bit too rich. Same thing with Mahomes.
Yeah, the guys going around him just have more upside. Maybe they're not as safe. And Pacheco will be a fine RB2. I definitely wouldn't want him as an RB1. He just does not have that ceiling to help win you a league as an RB1. And if you feel strongly about Pacheco and you think he can break out in year 3, and of course he's on a great offense with Andy Reid and Mahomes, like, there could be a lot of scoring opportunities, but I do think that's going to be very, very touchdown or bust for Pacheco. He just doesn't get a consistent enough carries. No games with more than 20 carries last year. Only 4 games with more than 16 carries. Just doesn't get the consistent work. And it'll be very touchdown dependent. And do we really want that, right? Because we want Mahomes to score, and we want these wide receivers we're about to talk about score some touchdowns. And of course, Kelce needs to get his as well. So we have to dig into the hardest part of evaluating this team to finish this episode, because it's the wide receiver room. Right now, they're all going so close to each other in the draft because nobody really knows how it's going to play out. So we're going to hit on Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy, and of course, Rashee Rice to finish up the Chiefs and this episode right after the break. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So again, to start off with this Chiefs wide receiver room, it is very confusing. And when you're looking at their ADP right now, there's three guys, three Chiefs wide receivers going within 20 picks of each other. Surprisingly, Marquise Brown is the most expensive at 65th overall. I'm shocked by that. Rashee Rice is going second at 74th overall. Probably will increase if he doesn't end up getting a suspension. That's, I think, some people's worry. And then Xavier Worthy is last of this bunch at 88th overall, the rookie wide receiver they took in the first round this year. Let's start with Rashee Rice. He averaged 30. He was the wide receiver 31 on average last year. Now he's going as wide receiver 39. We were really high on Rashee Rice last year, like during the year. But now the more I dig in this offseason, the less I like him for next year. And it's not even really just because of all the incidents that's happened off the field. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, he's the slot guy, and we've seen Juju Smith-Schuster in that role and do well, and he put up some good fantasy numbers the year before. He was not great, but he was overall a wide receiver 3. On average, he was a wide receiver 43 just a couple years ago. But that could also be due to the lack of weaponry. I mean, they were transitioning from Tyreek Hill. Now they've lost Marquez Valdes-Scantling, so they're going to look for some big plays downfield a little bit more with the new look guys. And we know that there's some versatility here with the two additions. Holly Brown, not necessarily a slot guy on the outside, but Xavier Worthy, I think, could transition to that as a rookie and be some value there. But overall, you got two outside guys that are not like Justin Watson and MVS and some of these guys, or Kadarius Toney, that they've trotted out. These are legit competitive guys. They're going to really take away some of the targets. And I think why we like Hollywood Brown a lot is because he's a veteran. He's not exciting. He hasn't been that way since he was with Lamar Jackson. But I think he could get revived here. He's a big play threat playing with a big arm quarterback. We've seen some highlights of them in minicamp. And again, pretty good rapport that I think will develop here in the summer between Mahomes and Marquise Brown. And keep in mind, he's had some nice years. He was disappointing, definitely, in staying healthy when traded to Arizona. But Baltimore, he was vibing there with Lamar Jackson. So keep that in mind. But the thing is, he's always been a big play, big game type of receiver. So you could see a game where he has 3 catches for 100 yards and a touchdown. Then you could go see a game where he has 1 target and 1 grab for like 17 yards. And that's all you get out of Hollywood Brown. So that could happen. I think Xavier Worthy in the end might have the best value because he's the guy that's going latest. And I always look at that. Everyone's kind of throwing darts to say, I don't know which guy exactly. I'm not sure when Rice is going to be suspended for how long. What are we going to do here? So that's why I think it goes to Hollywood being the value. So I'm going Hollywood Worthy. I think I'm with you. I don't want any part of Rice here. Just there's too much ambiguity about his availability, and I don't think he's worth it given these 2 additions that they have at wide receiver.
Yeah, the role he played last year, now that doesn't mean it's going to be the same role, but what we can expect, the role he played last year, it's just too short of targets, right? And it worked out last year when he was on the field a lot because he ended up getting a lot of targets in the second half of the season. It was only Kelce and Rice that even saw 9% of team targets share last year. So like it was only those 2 guys, and Rice didn't really have to fight with anyone else besides Kelce. Now with these other guys, he will. So we have to expect the targets won't be extremely high this year. And then his air yards per target were at 4.8 air yards per target, nearly 3 yards per target, fewer than any other wide receiver with 100 plus targets last year. Adam Thielen was second lowest at 7.5 air yards per target. Rashee Rice at 4.8. That you're going to need 140 targets to be a good fantasy wide receiver when it's that low. Unless you just are insane at breaking off just so much yards after catch. And that's just going to be really hard to do as any player. So I'm out on Rice. Like you mentioned, Hollywood Brown, you're much higher on him than I am. He's had 1 good fantasy season in 2021, wide receiver 26 fantasy points per game. He needed 146 targets from Lamar Jackson to get to just wide receiver 26. Again, I think Hollywood Brown and Rashee Rice hurt each other. So the one guy I'm taking a shot on is Xavier Worthy out of this group. going the latest. I'm a Texas Longhorns fan. I loved watching Xavier Worthy play. I think he's extremely hard to cover, and I do think he will be the deep threat in this offense. So when I'm worried about targets, right, I want the guy that can make those huge plays, be the deep threat. And I do think that's the role that Worthy will play in this offense. So I'm going to take a chance on him because he's going around like Christian Watson, Deontay Johnson. Like I'm okay with his costs there.
Yeah, and I think in general, either Hollywood or Worthy have way more upside than some of these guys because of who their quarterback is. Chris Godwin didn't transition well on the outside, new offensive coordinator. And we know that Mike Evans is the guy for Baker Mayfield. DeAndre Hopkins, we've already explained, not too into him as a fading target, especially with Calvin Ridley in Tennessee. Deontay Johnson, again, just a guy at this point in relation to the big playability of some of these guys, especially in the Panthers offense. Jordan Addison, Watson, you mentioned, Jackson Smith, Najigba, Cortland Sutton. None of these guys sound appealing, right? Because none of them are playing with Patrick Mahomes at quarterback in the same way. None of them are clearly having a shot at being the potential top downfield target on their team. So let's watch it play out a little bit with Brown and Worthy. They might bring along Worthy a little bit slowly. We know that the Andy Reid history with rookie wide receivers, it kind of changed that narrative a little bit with Rice last year. So anything is possible and can go in that direction. But it's taken a while since his taking over as a coach to see those rookies really manifest. So we'll watch that battle. Brown and Worthy, whoever looks like the guy lining up with the best chemistry early with Mahomes, that's the guy we're going to target most. But I think that's where you want to go. Just don't go too early for Rice. Unless we get some news, his suspension is gone. But I think you're a bit touchdown dependent for his numbers to really go off, right? As you mentioned, if the air yards are there and the yards per catch and attempt are there with these guys, you need less of them with the big plays and the touchdowns to be effective in fantasy.
Yep, absolutely. That is it for today's show. Thank you to you all for listening to Locked On Fantasy Football Everydayers. We will be back tomorrow talking about the Chargers and their 2024 fantasy outlook. Don't miss it. Bye, y'all.